Listen and learn the slow architecture of revenge that waits and then moves like winter over hands. In Beaufort County 1852, the Harding Plantation measured power not only in acres and cotton but in the silence it enforced. A young slave named Simon lived inside that silence and learned its grammar: the whip, the pillory, the rituals of humiliation. He fed the bloodhounds clean kennels, learned how animals read scent and how masters read fear. Ernest Harding and his son Jasper ran terror as business. Their dogs were instruments and the property practiced policy of dread. Simon held a strange position, trusted with access yet invisible, because trust meant utility, not dignity. From childhood he catalogued patterns: who left which gate doors were latched, and when the family relaxed into careless speech. He memorized routes: the curve on the road where carriage wheels slipped into shade, every fallen tree and hidden ravine. In 1849 the plantation stole from him everything. His sister Elenina was sold away pregnant, stripped of name and future. His mother Dorinda withered and died in silence, a slow death born of grief and resignation. That loss changed him. It sharpened observation into plan and private pain into patient instrument. For years Simon built intelligence from endurance. He watched routines, studied dog temperaments and the margins where men grew careless. He befriended the animals not with kindness but with study, learning hunger, ritual and scent as if training an enemy. The kennels were kept lean so dogs hunted harder. A hungry hound forgets moral categories at the smell of flesh. Simon did not move in random fury. He waited for conditions that turned violence into proof: the winter cold that preserves evidence and the family trip that left the house unattended. He recruited Joshua, a young man broken by a public whipping, turning shared cruelty into a compact of necessity. Together they prepared an old trap, axes, ropes, a tarp, and rehearsed a plan that favored certainty over spectacle. When the carriage hit the hidden trap, the road became a stage of reversal. Men who had made terror routine found themselves prey. Simon spoke as execution unfolded, naming each crime, recounting sales, beatings, and the price paid by his people as if words sharpened the lesson. He used winter as concealment and the dogs as instruments of erasure, feeding them what law had rarely been able to claim. The act was brutal, efficient, and final, and when the men vanished the plantation breathed differently, as if pressure had been released. This is not celebration but anatomy of method: how knowledge accumulated under oppression becomes weapons against the system. What follows will change your view. The forest swallowed the sound of their work and the plantation returned to routine as if nothing had occurred. Simon moved among the kennels like a man who had rehearsed grief into muscle and habit. He fed the hounds with a steady hand, mixing salt pork with the clandestine portion he had preserved in barrels. The dogs devoured what was offered, their tails beating in rhythm that matched his pulse. No one in the main house noticed the slight change in the meat, because cruelty makes small oddities normal. For the enslaved the act was an open secret, a pact that did not require words, each knowing glance a covenant of protection. They continued their work, maintaining silence because silence was their most effective shield. Simon kept his face neutral when the overseer passed and kept a cadence to his steps that read like devotion. Inside him the memory of Elenina and Dorinda braided into a dull hunger that no ceremony could ease. He did not celebrate the kills, he catalogued the relief, the weight lifted like a stone removed from a machine. At night he slept in short fits, listening for hounds to bark as if he feared the dogs might remember too much. Joshua walked among the fields like a man who had held his hand in flame and felt little afterward. They met near the old barn and sat with lanterns low, not to warm themselves but to witness that the world had shifted. For the white household days blurred into market talks, oblivious to absence and the subtle economy of fear. Adelaide busied herself with reforms, suspending punishments, altering rations, and asking awkward questions about births among servants. Her curiosity was a variable. Simon watched with guarded hope. He needed her ignorance as much as he needed her distance. The sheriff Whitmore scoured roads and woods, finding fragments and confused tracks but no clear trail to pursuers. When law meets carefully prepared absence, it snags on knot and thread and finds only partial stories to hold. Simon watched Whitmore as if law were another animal to study, learning how men pivot when pressure touches them. He had spent his life inhabiting surfaces, reading the deeper creases, and now those skills served a different purpose. Neighbors whispered yet avoided accusation out of habit and rank, because respect for property muzzled curiosity. That same respect had disguised horrors for decades until it met a patience patient enough to cut through. Method beat spectacle, quietness beat fury, and history learned that vengeance can be a patient craft. Remember this pattern because systems reward silence until someone chooses otherwise, and then everything changes and the world notices finally. When the investigators reached the kennels, they discovered what dreams and nightmares guard in the same heart. Fragments of bone lay buried in frozen earth, and the dogs' sleeping mats bore stains that could not be explained by ordinary diet. Dr. Harrison walked the rows with a sober face, cataloging fragments and murmuring about missing small bones and ragged cuts. The evidence shifted the case. Absence became proof, and proof demanded answers that the plantation was not prepared to offer. Sheriff Whitmore expanded his interviews, pressing each worker, asking for friendships and grudges and for the slightest deviation from the rehearsed script. He paced the slave quarters under lantern light, looking for a muscle the size of a lie, and found only disciplined restraint. Questions slid against the communal silence like blunt blades, and no one bled words for him to collect. Whitmore left notes in a ledger that read like suspicion without ownership, because the law requires anchors, not atmospheres. He turned his attention to Joshua, who had been visibly shaken during earlier questioning, seizing on trembling hands and hollow stares. Joshua denied involvement, claiming ignorance and fear, and the sheriff wrote the denials and felt the gap widen between what could be proven and what was true. There is a difference between innocence and protective loyalty, and Whitmore understood that culture could create a wall no man could measure. Meanwhile, in the main house, Adelaide wrote letters to relatives in Charleston, her script trembling as she tried to map out a sense of what had been lost. She authorized sacrifices of the dogs unable to bear their presence, and ordered kennels cleansed in a ritual that would not wash the stain from her mind. The plantation legal files piled in the study, and merchants came to ask where Ernest and Jasper might be, the market wanting continuity despite human rupture. Whitmore sent trackers into deeper woods and hired Ezra Collins, whose nose for path and route found the trap fragments and clothing swatches. Each discovery tightened the web, yet the crucial thread remained missing. The men did not appear whole to be accused in town. For the enslaved community, the discovery hardened resolve, but outwardly they pretended ignorance in an economy built on numbered silence. They held their compassion thin as paper and their unity like iron, because protecting their own sometimes required the courage to become accomplices to lies. Whitmore grew restless reading the map of absence, understanding that power shelters crimes with neighborly complicity. History watches quietly. Simon and Joshua left at night like ghosts, moving with intention. They crossed fields and hedgerows and slipped into the blankness of cold air. They navigated by landmarks Simon had traced for years: the bent oak, the moss-covered stone, the bridle path that led to safety beyond property lines. Their departure was aided by neighbors who had lanterns and shifted tools, creating misleading footprints. In the morning, the plantation discovered absence and treated it as emergency. The horses returned lameless, but the carriage and its occupants were gone. Whitmore raised alerts and sent riders to neighboring counties. The posters carried descriptions and rewards, but the fugitives had a head start, and the winter held their tracks. Local magistrates met, fearing contagion, that a precedent of blood could unsettle property markets. Within the slave quarters, the mood shifted not to triumph but to a sober kind of endurance. People who had watched centuries of power tighten its grip understood the limits of vengeance. They had helped Simon because they knew he had done what they had never dared, and because communal memory needs occasional radical punctuation. The sheriff forced denials until voices went hoarse, but the community refused to fracture. Word of the vanished owners traveled beyond county lines, and curiosity followed legal counsel from interested parties eager to resolve shipment contracts and land affairs. Adelaide faced a different pressure. The empty chairs in her family dining room altered her days and introduced questions she could not unsee during the long nights. She ordered the dogs put down in brutal attempt at closure. The abolitionist ideas she had flirted with in Charleston hardened into moral action. She applied legal pen strokes, freeing the people in her charge and severing the plantation's economic engine. This decision produced immediate financial collapse and social exile, but for Adelaide it was an act of reparation, a way to answer the unanswerable. Newspapers printed fragments of the story, and merchants recalculated losses while neighbors whispered curses and prayers in equal measure. Some accused her of madness, others of virtue, and the region watched the breakdown of a family as if it were a moral experiment conducted in public. Meanwhile, the fugitives moved under assumed names, crossing rivers and changing garments until their existence became rumor and then legend among free communities. Their disappearance did not erase consequence for those left behind, rather it suspended certainty and made a legal system confront a blank where bodies should have been. In taverns, men debated whether the slaves had acted as kings or animals, and the moral calculus of owners changed irreversibly across breakfast tables and ledger pages, and storylines colonized memory in unexpected ways. Adelaide's act of emancipation read like treason in the ledger books of the county and like salvation in the eyes of the enslaved. The signatures on the Manumission papers were not poetic, they were legal instruments that severed labor as commodity and transformed human bodies into persons on paper. When the ink dried, local creditors circled the Harding estate like vultures calculating losses, probate lawyers drafted furious memos, and neighbors calculated social distance. Adelaide walked among the cabins signing bonds for freedom and listening to conversations that had been muffled for a generation. Her hands trembled not from cold but from the enormity of reversing the economic lifeblood of an entire operation. She arranged passes, negotiating exit routes and safe landing spots for people who had never known choices. Some of the freed chose to leave immediately to distant towns, others remained in the area accepting the uncertainty of newfound agency. Adelaide's decision toppled the household hierarchy overnight, shifting the axis of power and leaving a vacuum, men in the county filled with rumor and thin anger. Her relatives denounced her, retreating into legal threats and alliances to bankrupt her socially and economically. They called her unhinged, a moral betrayer, and worse, trying rhetorical violence before resorting to legal assault. Adelaide accepted exile as a cost she was willing to pay. She joined abolitionist circles and taught what she had learned in quieter parlors about the rhythms of cruelty she once saw as normal. Newspapers treated her as spectacle, creating a record that would allow new narratives to surface later. For the black community, the Freedom Declaration produced immediate material changes: wages, small bargaining chips, and the ability to negotiate terms at market for the first time. It also produced the slow work of memory-building workshops, funerary rites, and the naming of children who had previously been anonymous in records. The old plantation that had been a certainty of order became a fragment in the county's memory, a place people mentioned with lowered voice and folded hands. Merchants recalculated trade lines, bankers demanded new collateral, and buyers circled the land at depressed prices, sensing moral hazard, and the county never forgot the rupture. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore carried the case like an ember in his pocket long after the snow had melted and the tracks had vanished. He was a professional who believed that order required answers and that unanswered questions corrode institutions from within. Whitmore built notebooks of testimony, margin notes that read like a man trying to stitch broken maps into a single route. He returned to the ravine to measure twig angles and revisit soil impressions as if the evidence might rearrange itself to become legible. Officials in nearby counties wrote polite queries and then turned away because local politics prefers puzzles to scandals that implicate the comfortable. During investigations, Whitmore discovered the limits of law when community silence moved like a shield around those who had acted to protect their own. He tried rewards paid for by merchants who feared contagion and tried public threats that courted outrage, but witnesses still held tongues like coins. The sheriff never had the forensic tools modern detectives enjoy, and his case depended on intuition and the stubborn refusal to accept absence as conclusion. When he retired, his notes became a private litany, a thin stack of papers that smelled of pipe smoke and concentrated attention. Years later, Whitmore's descendants would find the ledger and wonder at his obsession that had no satisfying resolution in life. The county moved on, property taxes were collected, and men continued to sit at tables configured by barter and lineage, yet a wound had been opened. The Plantation story turned into theater and rumor. People who had lost sons or sisters found a narrative that validated their private rage. The old kennels became an object lesson in hidden labor and slaughter, and travelers who paused at the tree line were told to walk softly. Until scientific methods matured, the case lived in small testimonies told by firelight and at church suppers where memory became testimony and sorrow. For those who had been freed, the story functioned as both warning and inspiration, reminding them that law cannot always be expected to deliver justice. Whitmore's failure in public terms became a catalyst in private ones. His papers inspired younger men to question how authority handles crimes tied to property and race. The thinness of legal reach taught people to bolster their own forms of mutual defense and memory work that might outlast formal proof. Decades later, historians and curious lawyers would sift through Whitmore's papers, finding patterns and asking why the powerful often escape the obvious consequences and memory persists. Oral history is a different kind of archive. It requires breath and repetition and the willingness of elders to speak names into being. In the late 1880s, grandchildren gathered under porches and in smoky rooms and listened as the last eyewitnesses moved through their memories. They spoke of Simon in the present tense because actions that restore dignity remain alive longer than official lines on a ledger. Stories arrived in fragments, minute details repeated like counting beads, each memory reinforcing another until a clearer picture formed. They told how Simon had loved his sister with a protective ferocity that hardened into strategic patience after he lost her to sale and then to death. They described the trap placed under leaves, the carriage overturning, and the terrible efficiency of two men who had learned slaughter from animal husbandry. The narrative that they repeated emphasized the communal nature of the act, not a lone miracle but a distributed decision made by people who had been ground down by cruelty. These accounts traveled to freedmen communities along rivers and train routes, where they became parables about justice and the limits of legal systems. Parents told children the story as both cautionary tale and a hymn of possibility, reminding them that courage exists even within the smallest gestures of preparation. Memory kept names alive, the names that paper had stripped away, and in doing so provided ammunition for claims and rights that would come decades later. For historians, these oral testimonies are messy data spanning emotion and time, yet inside the noise lies a form of truth that cannot be reconstructed from court records alone. Local churches preserved fragments, and minutes became evidence passed across generations until a grandson recorded the tale in a bound notebook. The voice of Mammy Dorinda came through those accounts, a figure who had held families together and taught children how to carry grief without breaking. She became a moral center in stories that otherwise might have offered only violence. As narrative, the community celebrated her endurance and transmission of care. By the time journalists began to ask questions, the story had already moved beyond simple chronology into myth, and myth makes different claims to truth. Simon shifted from avenger to ancestor in the narrative, and that change meant the story belonged less to crime and more to survival strategy. When younger scholars later combed the region for traces, they found not just bones and ledger notes but networks of kinship that had been forged during secrecy. The oral archive refused to be polite. It insisted on the presence of human cost, and in that insistence it demanded recognition and reparation, and history answers slowly. As decades passed, the story of Harding Plantation shifted its costume from rumor to testimony and back again. In the 1890s, curious researchers and descendants of freed people began to assemble fragments into more formal accounts. A handful of aged witnesses provided names, dates, and local landmarks, and one by one the puzzle gained tautness. They described how Simon and Joshua had scouted the route and moved under assumed garments toward river crossings where sympathetic boatmen promised passage. Some accounts placed them in coastal towns, others said they reached free communities in Florida or Georgia and lived under new names. There were rival claims and contradictions, merely human attempts to hold memory against the corrosion of years. Scholars later found marriage records and census lines that suggested some of the fugitives' descendants adopted trades as carpenters, bakers, barbers, and some evidence hinted at movement north. No definitive record tied a single man to a single place because many changed names and records were inconsistent in the wake of emancipation. The narrative that emerged emphasized the intentionality of the act, the calculated use of environment and timing, and the moral calculus of a people who had been systemically wronged. Newspapers began to print interviews with former slaves who had been children at the time, adding texture though often filtered through the biases of the journalists. Academics argued about method and motive, debating whether to frame the event as criminal or restorative, as rebellion or retributive justice. The legal system, however, had little appetite to reopen wounds that implicated local elites, and thus the official record remained thin and cautious. Yet folklore inside black communities preserved details that courts would not touch. They kept lists of favors and places where help awaited fugitives. When civil rights advocates later combed the archives, they found the story useful as an example of self-liberation and community protection against predation. Public commemorations were rare, but where they occurred they tended to be quiet gatherings at gravesites where names were recited and histories acknowledged. The absence of a single narrative made the story elastic in meaning, and that elasticity allowed it to teach different generations different lessons. For some, Simon was a hero who performed a long-overdue reckoning for brutality. For others, he remained a figure who forced uncomfortable questions about the price of vengeance. The truth did not resolve these tensions, instead it left them exposed, demanding that listeners decide how to weigh the scales of justice against cycles of harm. Descendants carried both shame and pride, some refusing to speak while others recorded the facts anew in family Bibles and oral recitations that insisted on continuity and memory-guided future resistance purpose. The Harding episode forces an inconvenient interrogation about how societies define justice and who gets to administer it. When institutions fail to protect those least powerful, they create gaps that ordinary people sometimes fill with extraordinary measures. This is not an endorsement of brutality but a recognition of mechanics. When law is tethered to property and prejudice, the oppressed must invent remedies. Simon understood the asymmetry intimately. He had lived under a regime that turned bodies into ledgers, and he used the very tools of that regime to dismantle a part of it. There are moral gradients here, shades of right and wrong that refuse clean edges and demand we live with ambiguity. Consider the legal apparatus in place at the time, servant to owners and blind toward systemic wrongs. It could not or would not prosecute those who were powerful. The Sheriff Whitmore might have wished for a courtroom with ironclad evidence, but such evidence rarely exists where silence is a strategy of survival. Communities of the oppressed develop parallel economies, rights and protections that look illegal to outside eyes but function as repair when formal systems break. Even today, when institutions favor the wealthy, are we surprised that people take matters into their own hands in hidden and sometimes violent ways? The story is also a lesson in how memory operates in the service of justice as much as law, failing that it preserves narratives that courts might ignore. When we listen to oral histories and community records, we hear a different ledger, one that counts suffering and resistance in units law does not measure. Simon and Joshua are complicated figures from modern morality. They expose the difficulty of reconciling survival-driven acts with the desire for a principled, nonviolent world. One cannot hold both absolutes with ease, especially when the tools of oppression are the same ones used to repair harm. The narrative forces us to ride the uncomfortable corridor between empathy and condemnation, to weigh motive and result and the interdependency of both. It asks us to ask what we would do when the options are starvation, silence, or striking back with the only resources available. And it pushes institutions to examine how their gaps create tragedies, because when authority refuses to act, it subsidizes other forms of justice. These are not tidy conclusions, rather they are provocations meant to keep us vigilant about the mechanisms by which power protects itself and how people respond. Modern reforms often mimic Adelaide's legal courage, but on broader scales, requiring institutional change, not individual heroism. Only systemic redress needs law education and public accountability to prevent private revenge cycles, and communities must build accountable channels for grievance. Now pause and participate if you want to make this lesson yours. Write the phrase iron root twice in the comments to bind your attention and signal transformation. Do it now. Iron root, and feel the ritual of acknowledgement, the gesture of naming that shifts an audience into witnesses. This is not theatrical, it is practical, because public naming forces accountability and shapes the memory we collectively preserve. After this small act, return here and listen how the rest of the story reframes justice and survival. The public call is also an experiment in engagement and identity. The algorithm responds to repetition and the human mind responds to commitment. When men repeat a phrase, they align thinking to action, and what begins as an audience becomes a participant in the historical line. After the comment ritual, we return to facts and philosophy and witness the consequences of choices taken under pressure. When Whitmore failed to secure legal closure, other forms of authority rose. The plantation's own code carried weight and people answered to it. The freed preserved the narrative as a method. They rehearsed the story when preparing for markets, when teaching children, and when negotiating labor after manumission. There is power in repetition, in testimony, and in ritual acts like the tiny comment you just made if you complied. Simon himself lived with ritual. He repeated routes, habits, and careful concealments until action fit his timetable like a well-tuned clock. Consider how public acts like Adelaide's manumissions and private acts like Simon's revenge create a bipolar dial between law and community-based justice. Each side claims moral clarity, yet both rest on fragile assumptions about human nature and control of violence. This section forces you to reckon with your sense of what is acceptable when normal channels are blocked by class, race, or custom. Once you have acknowledged the phrase twice, you have joined a community of witnesses and you stand differently in relation to the narrative. Witnessing is a moral posture. It does not convert outrage into prescription, but it obliges us to remember and to interrogate how systems produce suffering. When you comment, you participate in a small ritual that binds you to the question of what institutions will allow and what people will take into their own hands. From now on, as you listen to the remaining sections, think of yourself as a custodian of memory, a man responsible for asking hard questions and not turning away. Keep line between insight and indulgence of violence. Forensics in the mid-19th century were improvisational common sense wrapped in the authority of physicians and trackers. Dr. Harrison could not run tests modern detectives rely on, but he could read bodies and bones and interpret cruelty from pattern. His report to Whitmore described cut marks, irregular scatter, and missing small elements consistent with butchery, not mere animal scavenging. The presence of bone fragments inside the kennel and not only at the scene implied an intimate knowledge of the dogs and their feeding schedules. An investigator in that era had to translate scent and rumor into a narrative that juries could accept, and this required not only evidence but a plausible chain of custody. Whitmore struggled with chain of custody because the crime had been committed inside a system where owners controlled the means of production and narrative. The winter had preserved meat long enough to feed the dogs and slow decomposition, but it had also left tracks and impressions that blunted under late thaw. Simon used weather as ally. He understood how cold slowed decay and how rain could wash away the smallest oddity if timed correctly. Hunters rarely considered that prisoners had advantage from knowledge of routines. Whitmore and Ezra Collins followed an arc of discovery that moved from the trap articulation to the kennels and then to the scattered bones and ravines. They mapped cloth fragments and harness pieces and tried to reconstruct an account, but the human collaborators had already dispersed evidence in ways meant to confuse. County attorneys debated in secret, concluding trials would destabilize hierarchies and threaten commerce. So the law became cautious and the voice of the sheriff became a ledger of unresolved suspicions rather than indictments. Publicly, Whitmore filed logs while privately he filled notebooks with theories. He followed leads into river towns, into taverns, and into the lives of men who could have sheltered fugitives, but time and distance blurred many promising trails. The dismemberment patterns fascinated him not for morbid curiosity but because they suggested deliberate methods, someone who had studied butchering and animal feeding. That detail linked the crime to domestic knowledge and to a single skilled caretaker with access and motive. But motive and access do not convict a man in court, and Whitmore understood the practical limits of proving intent beyond reasonable doubt. So the investigation froze into a map of possibilities, a ledger of what might have been, and a set of questions that would follow generations. His ledger taught future investigators about law's limits and communal silence. It remained a lesson for those who study violence that sometimes the strongest evidence is memory and the bravest acts are those taken quietly, always from the vantage of the freed community. The Harding affair was not a cold case but a lesson in practical ethics born of necessity. They did not romanticize violence, but they understood the calculus that grows where law and mercy both fail. For many, the act was a form of communal redress, a statement that brutality carried cost when left unchecked for generations. They celebrated Simon and Joshua in private not as monsters but as agents who used minute knowledge to rebalance a ledger otherwise held by owners. This kind of moral imagination allowed people to reframe pain into strategy and survival into a kind of covert justice. The oral retellings emphasized care as much as violence. They spoke of Mammy Dorinda and the small rituals that maintained families against daily erosion. These stories taught younger generations how to navigate markets, courts, and the perilous psychology of serving those who own everything but empathy. The community built covert networks to sustain fugitives, offering clothes, food, and false papers, and instructing them to adopt trades that obscure origins. These were acts of repair, not chaos, a parallel civil system that aimed to re-establish dignity rather than simply reciprocate cruelty. There was also a recognition of cost. The community understood that revenge often leaves wounds that persist and that retribution carries the weight of new trauma. So many accounts include moments of doubt, not triumph. The older narrators would soften when describing blood and emphasize the sorrow behind necessary actions. Their ethics were local and pragmatic, rooted in a desire to prevent further theft of life, to prevent more mothers from wasting away in slow grief. The stories also functioned as pedagogy, teaching children how to read power, how to watch for softening in a master's routine, and how to trade information safely. For the freed leaders, the challenge was transforming episodic acts into lasting protections, which meant legal knowledge, property access, and political leverage. They campaigned for documentation and birth registrations for children and pushed for contractual wages and protections at market because law refurbished with equity undercuts private revenge. The Harding event entered their moral curriculum as both caution and precedent, a demonstration that when institutions fail, communal ethics may choose hard remedies. They established mutual aid funds, informal savings schemes, and designated elders to petition courts or document abuses. They taught crafts and trades to integrate fugitives and reduce vulnerability. Over decades, these measures lowered the need for violent reprisal and built political capital, and memory kept the bargain alive forever. Adelaide Harding left the South and took the story with her. She turned away from family and toward causes that matched her newfound convictions. In northern parlors, she found abolitionists who listened and helped translate her legal acts into broader advocacy. She lectured quietly about what she had witnessed and wrote letters that chronicled the economics of cruelty she had helped dismantle. Her speeches were not flashy, instead they relied on moral clarity and the peculiar authority of someone who had once been an insider in a system of predation. Many who heard her questioned the timing, her motives, and whether redemption was possible for someone who had been complicit for so long. She answered with a steadier voice, explaining that complicity is often a function of structure and that confession must lead to action, otherwise it is merely performance. Adelaide worked with relief societies to provide legal aid and documentation for freed people, advising on land claims and marriage certificates and the dangerous steps toward autonomy. She spent years helping to arrange schooling for children and vocational training, and she wrote to leaders urging reforms in state codes protecting labor rights. Her presence in these movements was controversial and sometimes resented by those skeptical of former insiders, yet for many she became a pragmatic ally. In private, she wrote letters to the families she had displaced, offering materials and aid that could not undo but could soften outcomes. A small number of descendants accepted her help and used it to claim land or start small businesses, while others turned away, refusing contact with the agent of former harm. Adelaide never receded into anonymity. She accepted scorn and threat as part of the price of action and continued to operate at the margins of respectability. Her life was a study in uneven reparation efforts, showing how individual acts can seed institutional change if they are coupled to policy and collective effort. When she died years later, newspapers noted her eccentric career and obituaries debated whether she had been heroine or penitent sinner. To some she remained a figure of scandal, to others an example of conscience grown into craft, but to the communities she once freed she was often simply remembered for the practical help she provided. Her story complicates the simple binaries of sinner and saint and asks modern audiences to weigh courage, accountability, and the long work of repairing harm. She influenced local policy debates, urging registry systems and periodic inspections of labor conditions. Her interventions informed later statutes and inspired young activists who credited her testimony with changing municipal oversight and creating jobs for freed families across regions. And the moral lesson endured in classrooms. The Harding house fell into ruin as if the building itself had exhausted the memory it held of violence and silence. Buyers came with blueprints and left with stories of cold air and missing tools and men who would not sleep on that porch. Vines climbed columns and nights filled with wind that sounded like distant voices, and once proud rooms sagged under dust. Locals told stories to children about the place, a moral lesson folded into dares to stay after sunset and touch the threshold. Sometimes hunters claimed they heard hounds baying, although no pack moved those sounds tethered to a past that refused neat burial. The land around the house was parceled, sold and resold, but the aura of the event carried beyond deeds and maps. In the early 20th century, families of the freed returned and laid simple markers at the slave burial plot, stones with weathered names or the word remembered. Those markers made the ground sacred for some and contested for others, yet they created a physical claim that paperwork had once denied. A small committee formed to preserve the site, arguing material traces of atrocity should remain to remind future generations of what silence allows. Others argued the land belonged to commerce, that the ruin made recovery difficult, and that removing physical traces would help communities move on. That debate shaped how the place was treated in schoolbooks and in county histories. Some chapters listed it as cautionary while others excised it to protect reputations. Academics later excavated in careful seasons and found domestic shards, clothing remnants and soil layers that corroborated fragments of oral testimony. Archaeological evidence never captured the full human texture of decisions and feelings, but it added weight to stories and made them harder to dismiss. Pilgrims came, those who wanted to see places where injustice had once been practiced and those who sought to testify in person for the victims. The ruin functioned as a moral geography, a place people visited to reckon with the past, to teach warning to sons and daughters, and to pause in reflective silence. Over time, artists wrote poems about the thresholds and plays drew stage scenes that asked audiences to confront the ordinary forms of cruelty that led to the violent rupture. The land remained ambiguous, property lines overlaid with memory, and whenever townspeople debated development, they always returned to the question of what it costs to forget. In recent decades, community guardians organized cleanups, annual gatherings, and placed plaques that told names and dates. The memorial became modest but continuous proof that remembering requires labor and that stewardship of truth is an active civic task, and memory resists easy erasure. The Harding story travels beyond history lessons into present concerns about power, transparency, and institutional accountability. When organizations defend reputation over truth, they create conditions where abuse can be normalized or ignored entirely. Modern institutions that shield elites with legal teams and public relations often replicate the same mechanism that protected plantation owners. We still confront problems where wealth buys silence and bureaucratic complexity suffocates clarity and community voice. The lesson from Simon's Act is not a call to private violence but an insistence that systems must be probed and restructured. Policy reforms matter, documentation matters, and audits matter because they create public conditions where grievances can be addressed without bloodletting. Whistleblower protections and independent oversight are contemporary equivalents of the memorial markers and Manumission papers Adelaide pushed into law. We must also invest in civic education so that ordinary citizens can read contracts, understand their rights, and refuse to accept exploitation disguised as custom. The Harding case shows how dangerous it is when social status immunizes people from scrutiny and how difficult it becomes to dislodge narratives convenient to power. One response is legal reform, another is cultural change, changing how communities treat the vulnerable and how we teach young men to measure worth. This requires constant attention from journalists, lawyers, activists, and citizens who value a society where power is accountable and where memory can be mobilized. The story also warns that moral clarity requires infrastructure if we want compassion to outlast individual acts of conscience. Create institutions that turn private accountability into public process. That way people do not need to take extreme measures to secure justice. If we allow systemic biases to persist, then cycles of resentment and clandestine revenge will continue to be born from necessity rather than choice. The modern citizen who studies this case must ask what role he will play in building systems that favor transparency, not cover up crimes. Ask whether your companies, your local government, and your institutions have independent mechanisms to investigate credible allegations without conflict of interest. If not, then begin building them locally through civic forums, watchdog groups, and informed voting, because prevention depends on collective intelligence applied with rigor. History teaches us that good intentions are insufficient and that structural change requires operative law and sustained community effort. Practical steps include funding legal aid clinics, offering free counsel and document help, establishing independent review boards with community seats and veto power, training investigators and judges in cultural competence, creating public complaint registries, and funding survivor support and reparations programs that reduce incentives for private retribution. These measures make justice accessible, reduce secrecy, and build durable civic capacity to redress harms without resorting to violence. Legends serve a social function. They condense complex moral dilemmas into narratives that can be passed with rhythm and emotion. Simon became a figure whose life condensed years of pain and the possibility of striking back in measured ways. Folk singers wrote verses about the ambush, about the trap, and about the slow feeding ritual that turned predators into instruments of erasure. These songs traveled along rivers and wagon beds and chimneys and were sung in call and response at gatherings where memory was communal. Storytellers adapted details to teach lessons about strategy, patience, and the ethics of taking action when systems fail. In some versions, Simon is a tragic hero, in others a cautionary figure who warns listeners about the price exacted by violence. His name moved into idioms used in workshop floors and in market squares, a shorthand for covert justice and for the power of long preparation. The legend also produced protective rituals, communal codes where safe houses were designated and signals agreed upon for fugitives to seek shelter. This cultural apparatus provided a survival blueprint for those who needed to vanish and reappear under new identities to build stable lives. The narrative elasticity allowed different communities to emphasize what they needed in their historical moments, sometimes focusing on resistance, sometimes on reconciliation. Folklore also served as moral plumbing. It carried heat from private grief into public discourse where it could be moderated and rechanneled. As generations passed, the songs softened certain details and amplified others, and in that shift the core lesson persisted that silence can empower and memory can wound. Writers later used Simon's story in novels and poems, exploring the moral ambiguity of retribution and the structural conditions that produce it. Filmmakers shot scenes of the ravine and the kennel and used chiaroscuro to dramatize the moral shadow in the faces of perpetrators and survivors. Public historians argued about whether myth enhances or obscures truth, yet most agreed that legend kept the story alive in ways formal archives did not. When a community turns a violent event into an instructive narrative, it both remembers and reframes it, giving younger listeners a code to interpret injustice. Simon became less an individual than a node in a network of stories that taught navigation through power hierarchies and how to convert pain into protective action. Legends do not replace evidence, but they supply cultural energy for those who must transform memory into reform and for those who seek to avoid repeating past horrors. Storytellers carry responsibility. Curators and teachers must decide how to present violence with context and care. Museums and curricula that include the story help translate caution into policy and civic awareness today. Power always wears a mask, and the Harding story shows how the mask becomes permission when institutions adopt indifference as policy. Those who wield power invest in narratives that absolve them, and they rely on legal and cultural frameworks that normalize their actions. Simon inverted that logic by using the owner's tools against them, revealing that knowledge and patience can unmake privilege in specific moments. Yet his act leaves moral residue because while it removed two predators, it did not repair the centuries of damage nor restore lost childhoods and names. When we evaluate such actions, we must hold two truths at once: that oppression produces rage, and that rage produces choices with collateral wounds. The man who studies Simon must also ask what he would do when faced with similar structural cruelty, and whether his instincts favor law or direct intervention. Modern men obsessed with mastery and secrets will find in this case both a template for cunning and a warning about seduction by vengeance. Skill without moral infrastructure risks becoming another form of domination, and the hardest lesson is learning to couple capacity with accountable aims. The story invites reflection on leadership too, on how those in positions to make incremental reforms can act early and prevent radical outcomes. Leaders who choose transparency and provide avenues for redress undercut the justification for private retribution by making justice visible and accessible. We also must interrogate the economies that made such horrors possible. The commodification of human life, a calculation repeated across history whenever markets outweigh morality. The narrative asks men to become custodians, not owners, to see power as stewardship and to refuse the comforts of willful ignorance. It demands moral labor, which includes listening to oral history, visiting memorials, and pushing for institutional designs that limit incentives for violence. Simon becomes a mirror for each listener, a figure who asks you what kind of power you will build, whether you will hide cruelty or expose it. This is a dangerous lesson because it invites action, but also a necessary one because inaction leaves the same structural harms intact. If you want to master systems, then begin by mastering accountability for your institutions, your companies, and the civic spaces you inhabit. Begin small. Teach apprentices to document wrongs and to demand oversight. Create community boards. Fund legal clinics. Support independent reporters and back public archives. Teach men to turn dominance into stewardship and secrecy into transparency. Mentor them to insist on audits, training, and public review so that courage becomes institutional, not episodic. When structures fail, organize legally and insist on evidence-based reform rather than private acts of finality, and keep memory alive through teaching. Always listen closely, because this final section is not an ending but a recalibration, a commitment to how knowledge changes behavior. You have heard names and places, strategies and moral dilemmas. You have been invited to witness and to carry the story forward. The purpose of telling these dark histories is not to titillate but to instruct, to force a mirror, because men who understand power must also understand restraint. The Everhart cases, the Harding episode, and others are patterns that repeat when institutions prefer silence to remediation and profit over human life. We must develop rituals of public accountability, procedures that require transparency, and practical steps to prevent recurrence. Create records, make them public, fund independent investigation, and insist that evidence be preserved, not allowed to wither under convenient amnesia. Teach the next generation how to read hidden signs, how to verify claims, and how to create durable community protections that reduce the conditions of extreme acts. Remember the phrase you wrote earlier as a commitment: iron root, iron root. Those two words are your small oath to attend to truth and to act with measured courage. This is the transformation the channel offers, not a fleeting thrill but a hardened attention to structures and how to change them. If this story unsettled you, let it energize your resolve and not your appetite for clandestine retribution. Take action that builds capacity rather than destroys it. Donate to legal clinics, volunteer with oversight groups, demand local audits, and support public archives that preserve memory and provide evidence when institutions wobble. Teach your sons and brothers to value accountability and to view power as stewardship, not merely as leverage over the vulnerable. Those who hide behind prestige will continue to rely on our silence to operate, so speak where you have authority and create alliances across classes and races. If you are a leader, form review boards. If you are a citizen, support transparency, and if you are an employer, ensure your workplace has clear channels for complaints and independent review. This is dangerous knowledge because it reveals weaknesses in systems and human nature, but that is why it must be wielded with responsibility and strategic foresight. I have shown you patterns and given you language. Now it is on you to act, to convert knowledge into durable institutional reform. If you found this narrative valuable, subscribe, like, and share. Think of this as a dispatch to the present, a map for vigilance and a manual for collective memory. Keep the story alive, not as spectacle but as a practical demand for systems that favor justice and human dignity over property and silence. Carry this responsibility with courage and humility.